My name is Rob. I work for Microsoft. I'm an architect with Microsoft. My job is to work. I'm going to make it hard on the guys recording because that pace. I work with partners, specifically partners in the container space, helping them to get onto the Azure platform. So I work closely with Mesosphere, Docker, and a few of the other partners we saw out in the out there. So what I wanted to do today, as I started moving into this space, it was just massively confusing as to what the offerings are within kind of the Microsoft ecosystem. So what I thought I would do is try to kind of clear some of that up. So hopefully by the end of the day today, what you'll have an understanding of is what are the Docker fors. So there's Docker for Azure, Docker for Windows. What do those do for you? Docker for Mac, etc. What do those do for you? Then we'll talk about Windows containers. And I'll give you a demo of Windows containers. I'll give you a demo of Docker for. Then we'll talk about Azure Container Service. Who knows what Azure Container Service is? Almost nobody. Okay, so we'll walk through it. I'll actually get it up and running. I'll actually show you how to connect to it and deploy something. I'll use DCOS, but nothing would stop me from using deploying the Swarm. So you can see just how easy it is to basically take advantage of that managed service. Then we'll talk about, really briefly at the end, I'm going to talk about our enterprise solutions. So how you could, if you were in an enterprise and you wanted to have the enterprise grade solution of either Docker Datacenter or Enterprise DCOS, I'll show you how you can do that. And then if I have time, I'll show you running .NET on Linux and container. I just thought that was kind of fun. And if you're a .NET person, it's actually quite useful. So with that, let's get started. I need to kind of get a gauge on my time. So it's 10:02 or 9:52. All right, cool. So let's start with Docker for. So Docker for Azure. This is an offering by Docker, and their goal is to make it as easy as possible for you to deploy Swarm in Azure. Now I'm going to show you ACS is going to actually be a little bit faster for you, which you'll see in a minute. But and then Docker for Windows. How many of you have seen or used Docker for Windows, or at least know what it is? So maybe about half. If you don't know what it is, it's a native Windows application. And it allows you to run containers on your Windows box and do all your development on your Windows box. So if I'm building Linux containers, I can use Docker for Windows. We've got a hypervisor that gives you a VM that you run your containers inside of, and it's all blind to you. So it's very simple. I'm going to give you a demo that shows you exactly how to work with it. And you have full CLI compliance. So it's not like you're using some shaved down version or something that's not a realistic environment. You get a complete development environment on Windows. In fact, Docker for Windows is arguably the easiest way to develop both Windows containers as well as Linux containers. And I can show you there's a simple switch for working with it. So with that, let's just do a quick demo of Docker for Windows. So the first thing we'll do is just open up a browser, do a search for Docker for Windows. Let's see. All right. We'll do this the easy way. Installation on Windows. So if you go to docs.docker.com, whack engine installation, whack Windows, you can see right here, Docker for Windows is going to tell me exactly how to install it. It's very simple, just a simple installer. It's under 2 minutes. Once you have it up and running, you can just very simply, if you look in your tray here, you can see I've got Docker running in my tray. Let's see if I zoom it around. So you can see Docker running right in my tray. One of the kind of the high level, if you're not, yeah.
Is it like Windows 10?
Yes, it's Windows 10 only. Yeah, in fact, it's Windows 10 Anniversary Edition. So when you're trying to install it, if you don't have the right edition, it'll tell you, and then you just gotta install the latest edition. If you're a UI guy, you can open up Kitematic, and Kitematic gives you a nice UI. All I did was just from that context menu, open it up, and I get a nice UI into the containers running on my system. The interesting thing, I'm able to just access any containers out in the wild, out of Docker Hub, and I have a nice UI here. So if I wanted to install Hello World Nginx, I can just create that, click on it, it's going to get installed, and it's going to do all the port mapping for me. If I'm wondering what port things are running on, I can go over here to settings. You can see I now have access to the logs. I can go down to settings, and I can take a look at ports, and I can see that it mapped that Nginx 8080 over to port 32769 on my machine. I now have Nginx running in a container on my Windows that I have access to from my Windows box. So if I open up maybe IE or Chrome or whatever my browser of choice is, and I go to localhost, whack, whatever that port was that I just saw in the port mappings, need HTTP. You can see I'm running Nginx. All well and good. I'm guessing most of you work in the command line. You probably don't want to use a UI. It's a little too not manly enough for you. So we'll close out the UI. It's making me feel kind of dirty having the UI up there. So let's open up a command prompt. So I've got a command prompt. Okay. Now what I have is I wrote a very simple Spring MVC app on my machine here. And by the way, a simple Spring MVC app configured in Eclipse took me about a day to get Hello World running with Eclipse. A very simple 19 steps, and I was up and running, and we're all good to go. So I've got this little simple app running up and go. Let's get it going. Let's run it up in my little local Tomcat server. I'm going to go ahead and run it up in my Tomcat, and you can see just how simple this thing is. Give it a second, and we're going to go to the proper URI that I've mapped. I think it's greeting.html. And we get my hello world. Now, if you want to see where that's coming from, if we take a look at my controller, I told you this is a simple one. We're not looking for any Java genius here. I'm just writing an attribute called greeting, and I'm setting a value of hello world. So let's do hello ContainerDays. Okay, save that. And then I've got this little JSP page that's just writing out that little attribute. So very simple. Now, when I compile this thing, so if I go ahead and file, export, generate my WAR file, and let's go to my destination, will be to overwrite my WAR file. When I compile this, if I go down to the file system, actually, see if I can find that. Actually, we can see it inside of Eclipse. If I take a look at my out directory, you can see a Docker file is actually automatically generated for me. Okay, so remember, I'm running Docker on Windows now. I want to, if you take a look at this Docker file, oops. If you take a look at this Docker file, you can see it's coming from a Tomcat image. So I'm going to run a Linux container. I basically want to build that container, and then I want to run it all from Windows. So let's do that. So I'm going to go down to command prompt. I'm going to do Docker build. I'm going to call it Bagby Spring MVC app. We're going to use this thing later. This is such a powerful app. Give her a second to build. Let's run it. I'm mapping this to port 8085 on my local host. Okay? So I'm going to run this thing up. Should be running. Let's see. Thank you. Okay, it's up and running. We just go to localhost, and I go to localhost 8085, whack products web, whack greeting.html. Give it a a second to think about it, and you can see now I've deployed and ran that container all from my Windows box. So that hopefully shows you in a very quick pace the workflow you have available to you developing if you happen to be on Windows. Oh, one last thing to show you. I don't have the right version running on my box here, but if I did, I could easily switch over to Windows containers just by hitting this switch here. You switch to Windows containers, and then hypervisor would be loading a Windows kernel VM that I could run those containers in. So hopefully you get an idea, or that gives you a high-level idea of the power. If you happen to be running on Windows and you want to develop containers, that's the easiest way to do it. Let's move on to Windows containers. So Windows containers, basically what we did at Microsoft, like I was sitting in there with the engineers, what the engineers did on the Windows team is they basically built all their abstractions required to support containers. So C groups, namespaces, we'll have a really brief look at that. Can't go into too much depth given the time or my knowledge. But we basically built out all of the required abstractions in order to support containers. And so now we have support for Windows containers and 2 flavors of Windows containers. And I'm going to walk you through a nice visualization I built to show you how Windows containers relate to Linux containers in just a minute. But we have 2 flavors, or 2 choices of deployment in Windows containers. You can either deploy a typical Windows container, which has the same isolation that you'll have when deploying a Docker container, or you can deploy Hyper-V containers. So how many times have you heard the objection of using containers? Well, I can't handle a shared kernel. Shared kernel, it's not isolated enough for me. Hyper-V container solves that problem. So you have your own kernel running in your own process space. Okay? So here's kind of a high-level visualization. If you look at all the abstractions in Linux that have made containers viable for years, well prior to Docker, C groups, namespaces, the layered file system, we built all of those abstractions into Windows. We also had to bake into the Docker open source engine the ability to talk to some of these new abstractions in Windows. And that's an important point to make. There's not some other binaries you need to bring down, or you don't have to do anything extra. It's all baked into the open source Docker engine, the ability to work with Windows containers. There's native support for Windows containers and Linux containers. It's not one and then some kind of, duct taped on add-on. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the advent of a variety of virtualization. So I'm going to start with no virtualization. You've got OS running on top of hardware and the application running on the OS. Then came virtual machines, which gave us hardware virtualization. So we had a hypervisor, and then we had a bunch of different VMs running on top of that. Then we had containers, and containers running on metal. You had hardware, and then the kernel, and then you had containers running on top of the kernel. And so they're all sharing the same OS. And you had containers on VMs. So now I can basically use a hypervisor to separate differing OSs running on the same physical machine, and then I can have a bunch of containers that are all sharing that OS. It's all good, but we have that problem. This is where that challenge comes about, where people say, you know what? I can't have a shared kernel for these containers. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't meet my requirements. And that's where Windows containers come in. Windows containers with Hyper-V, I mentioned there are 2 models. So you've got one model, which is the Windows Server container, which looks just like Linux containers. They're sitting on top of a shared kernel. But you can also deploy them as Hyper-V. And when you deploy them with an isolation level of a Hyper-V, you're not sharing a kernel. You're running your own kernel. In fact, if we had 2 different operating systems, 2 versions of Windows Server, for instance, that supported kernels, you could have both of those running on the same machine. And that's...
So at that point, what's the difference between using that model and using a full VM? Just running another...
It's much faster. The question is, what's the difference between using a full VM and using Windows containers Hyper-V? It is slower than the Hyper-V deployment is slower than a Windows Server container, but it is much faster than using your own Hyper-V. And the reason is that we wrote our own virtual machine which is optimized for just running containers. And they were able to build out a bunch of I don't know if you call them shortcuts, I can't think of optimizations to running containers. And so if you're interested in it, if you go out to Channel 9, which is Microsoft's Channel 9, there's a deep dive into Hyper-V containers by Taylor Brown as one of the PMs, and he actually walks you through some of the numbers on the ability to deploy a Hyper-V container versus deploying a virtual machine. A virtual machine that is running on a clean system for Windows could take up to a minute, if I remember correctly. To boot up a Hyper-V container can be 3 seconds. So you do get some optimizations. If you don't mind, can we hold the questions till the end? I'm kind of pushing it on time as it is, and if not, I'll be here and we can chat. So let's take a look at Windows containers. Okay, so what I've got is I didn't even write this thing. I didn't want code to get in the way of what we're trying to do here. I've got a Windows native, a 4.6 Windows or .NET MVC app. This thing only runs on Windows. This is not .NET Core. This thing will only run on Windows. And if we run it up, it's just going to be that kind of out of the box, the template if you use .NET. How many of you guys and gals write in .NET? Anybody? Some of you, maybe 40%. This is just a typical .NET app that only runs on Windows. And what I want to show you is how we can run this thing inside of Windows containers. I've kind of over-engineered the demo a little bit, so you'll have to bear with me. I was doing some work with Docker on building a Jenkins pipeline, so I figured I'd show you that as well. So anyways, just a very simple ASP.NET app. This is the template that's provided to you out of the box. What I want to do is I want to run this thing in a Windows container. So let's make a change to it though. You can see I wrote containers ASP.NET. Let's change that to ContainerDays. I'm going to then push it up into Git. Then I'm going to run a Jenkins job, which is going to take this thing down. It's going to build a container, and it's going to deploy that container to Docker Hub for me. Okay? And then we'll run it on. I'm actually going to run it on the build server, on the Jenkins build server. Everyone understand the scenario? Okay. Let's do it. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is make a change. So I'm going to change this from containers, ASP.NET, let's just call it ContainerDays. Save it. We got to give it some respect. Full capital D. Good? All right, so I'm going to save that. Let's open up a command prompt. This command prompt is to the location, the root of my application. So I'm just going to do git add. Let's prove to ourselves, whoops. Let's open up a new command prompt, not recognize. What's that?
GIS, GIT, should have typed.
Oh, I misspelled it? Sorry. I can't see this font, and I normally wear glasses, but if I wear the glasses, I can't see you. So I'm kind of flying blind here. So give me, I don't feel bad if you yell out that I'm misspelling something. Let's just do git add. Thank you. This is good help. Let's see. Okay. Let's take a look and just prove to ourselves that we have that change in there. That's the file I changed. Let's do a git commit. And let's do a git push. Okay, so now we're running up. Now we push it up into GitHub. Now, I didn't set up a webhook. But that's okay. We'll just go ahead and kick off this job by ourselves. So I should have already created an RDP. I guess I didn't. So let's RDP into that server. You can get to this RDP via the portal, but it would just take a little bit longer, so I'm just going to go in here. So this is a VM that's running Windows Server 2016 with support for containers, and it's running Jenkins on it as well. Okay? So when I RDP into this, I'm basically going to kick off a Jenkins job. While that's running, it takes about 3 minutes for that job to run. As I mentioned, the Jenkins job is going to bring down my code from Git. It's going to compile. It's going to create my Docker file. It's going to bring in all the dependencies from NuGet. God willing, it'll connect. Once I do that, once that's running, I'll show you the Docker file, and then we'll take a look at the Git job that's running, and then we'll run the container. Or I'll sit here and wave my arms for a few minutes while this doesn't work. And try to go back in. I did this twice this morning before, it just went just like lightning. Well, while that's thinking about connecting, let's take a look at the Docker file. Here's the Docker file that I'll be running from that Jenkins process. You can see the very top says from Microsoft IIS. So that is a Windows container or a Windows image right there. And that's got Windows Server 2016 and IIS running on it. Next thing I do is I install Chocolatey. And Chocolatey is just going to allow me to do some command line compilations fairly easily. And then I start adding in the features that I needed. So I add in ASP.NET 4.5, the Microsoft build tools. I add in NuGet so I can bring down my dependencies, MS build so I can build, and then a web config transformer. Next thing I do is I basically build out my container. So if you'll see here, here's where I do my NuGet restore. I'm actually going to build out the container inside of the job. So do my NuGet restore, and then I copy all my files over to inetpub, which is where the web server wants those. So let me see if I can. I don't know why I can't seem to connect in there. All right, well, we'll skip that bit of the Windows demo, and I'll see if I can connect in a little bit later. It's very odd. Do it one last try. All right. Well, we'll move on, and I'll give it a go a little bit later. So after once I'm able to connect, I'll show you how we can run that, how we can basically run that container up in there after we run the job. So for now, let's move on to Azure Container Services, and then we'll see where we get with RDPing in. So what are Azure Container Services? Most of you hadn't heard of them before. Basically, if you look at the open source offerings of Mesos and Swarm, Mesos and Marathon together being DCOS and Swarm, basically what we have in ACS is a managed service. So it's a container service where we help you to deploy out a cluster using best practices that allows you to run either DCOS or Swarm in Azure in literally minutes. Now, it is all open source. In order to be as part of Azure Container Service, we worked with Mesosphere and Docker, and anything that got into ACS had to be open source. That was the low bar. And the reason why we did that is because we want to offer complete portability of your containers in your application. We are running the exact same version of Mesos and Swarm that you could run in your data center. Or you could run it, on-prem, in your offices, wherever you want it to. Or on your laptop, the exact same thing. So if we're using the exact same, if we're offering the exact same open source software, the question is, what is ACS? Really, it just allows you to have a managed service to where you can deploy very easily. So we have the infrastructure in Azure. In order to build out that cluster by hand for you, I'll show you what it looks like. It would take you hours, if not days, to walk through all of the challenges. Anybody that's installed Mesos by hand, you realize, I've got to build out the entire infrastructural cluster, make sure I've got that all working, and then I've got to configure all the software. We do all that for you. We also offer support. So what you've got is you've got a couple orchestrators. You've either got DCOS open source, or you've got Swarm open source. What we provide, or what we behind the scenes build, is what's called an ARM template. And the ARM template is how we deploy things in Azure. It's basically a JSON file that defines the topology of what you want. It says, all right, you need these 2 load balancers, and you need these VMs, and these VMs need to have public IPs, etc. All of that, what the cluster looks like, is encapsulated in something called an ARM template. And I can show you what one of those looks like. I've got a little extra time because my last demo didn't work. So we can see what one of those looks like, but it happens behind the scenes for you. And I'll show you how you can deploy one of these. If you do, so you really only have to worry about your application. If you do want to move up the stack, as I mentioned, we have enterprise offerings in Azure. You can use Enterprise DCOS, or you can use Docker Datacenter. And at the end, I'll show you how that works as well. So what does Azure Container Service from an infrastructural standpoint look like? Well, following best practices, you'll see there's really kind of 3 different subnets here. In the first subnet on your left, that's your master nodes. That's where you're going to send in any commands. So if you're going to deploy anything, that goes into the master nodes. All the commands you write talk to the master nodes. Then you have 2 sets of worker nodes. You've got the public, which is what you see in the center, and it has a load balancer sitting in front of it. And then on the very right, you've got your private. So what's the difference? In that public cluster, that's where you put things like your internal load balancers. If you're using like Marathon LB, HA Proxy, that's where you put those. That's the only, if it needs to be publicly accessible, it belongs in that center or the public agent pool. Okay? All of your applications, all of the logic applications, if you had an Nginx app, or in the Windows world you had an IIS app or something like that, those would all sit there in that private pool. So what you'll see is where you're scaling things, you're scaling that private pool. Rarely do you see yourself scaling this pool. Okay? Why would you deploy a load balancer sitting inside of this private pool? Or excuse me, the public pool. Why would you have a load balancer in there? I just showed you that we've got this big load balancer right up here. Why would I deploy a load balancer in here? You don't have to, but you probably want to because of portability. If you have your load balancer, all of your load balancing logic set up in that public pool, you can take your exact application, your exact workload, and move it between Azure or on-prem or wherever. Okay? So it gives you that full portability. So those are best practices. And so we'll actually deploy in just a minute. We'll deploy a load balancer into this public agent cluster, and then we'll deploy an app into the private cluster, and we'll see it load balance and see just how easy it is. Does that all make sense? Yeah. Let's see it go. Okay, so if I wanted to create an ACS cluster, let's just walk through it. Let's walk through the steps. It takes about 12 minutes to deploy it, so I'm not going to actually deploy it. I've got one deployed, but I'll show you how to do it. So you just go in. You guys are all familiar with the Azure portal, hopefully. Portal.azure.com, get an account, and you can deploy a cluster. And we'll see how fast we can do that. So I'm going to do Azure Container Service. I'm going to click there. And I really have just a few things once I choose Azure Container Service, as opposed to deploying this giant cluster and configuring Mesos or configuring Swarm. All I have to do is follow a few very simple steps. And we're following the best practices, and we'll deploy all this for you. So I have to create a username. This is essentially the admin name on the underlying boxes. So I'm just going to say VM admin, and then I need an SSH public key, so let me get my SSH public key. Nothing to see here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource group. We'll just call it Bagby RG, delete. I'll click OK. Now I get to choose. Now I've got to choose what my orchestrator is. Do I want to use DCOS or do I want to use Swarm? I'm going to use DCOS. This is you can't choose one and then change later. You'd have to redeploy into a new cluster if you wanted Swarm or DCOS. So I'll deploy DCOS here. And then I've just got to set a few settings. Give it a little second here to go, and then we'll be up and going. I'm going to bring up another. Okay, so here's where I choose my agent count, and then my master count. And this is going to be the agent count. These are going to be my private agents. So I'm just going to choose 3, and then my master count 1, 3, or 5. Maybe I'll choose 3 here. And then I create a DNS prefix. And this is the DNS prefix that I'm going to use, and I'll show you how that equates a little bit later to access these. So we're going to set up a public IP address and DNS. So if I set my DNS prefix to be ACS cluster, if I wanted to get to my masters, it would be something like ACS cluster master.azure.cloudapp.net or something like that. Make sense? So I just called it Bagby ACS or something like that. Then I'd click OK. And then I'd click OK and done. And that's it. That's all I need. I'm not short-circuiting the system at all here to build an ACS cluster. What you would get after about 12 minutes looks like this. This is one I deployed, I think, yesterday. These are all of the items that got created behind the scenes for that cluster. If you remember that little visualization I had, we had 2 load balancers. We had one sitting in front of the masters. Here's the load balancer sitting in front of the masters. Here's the load balancer sitting in front of the agents. The VMs for my masters are right here. Here are the masters VMs. The agents, both private and public, they're not specific VMs. We have something in Azure called a virtual machine scale set, which allows you to easily scale out VMs, so it's an abstraction that sits over VMs. So if I had a scale set of 3 VMs and I said, I want to move this to 5, we'll very quickly be able to scale that out to 5. That's why you don't see those VMs. But you'll also see a bunch of stuff in here. You see the public IP addresses, the NIC cards, the public IP addresses, etc. Okay? So how do I connect to this thing? I've got my ACS cluster up. I want to connect to it, and I want to deploy something. Let's do that. I mentioned that we deploy to the master, right? So we've got to get the master's DNS name, or the master's IP address. And in Windows, we use a tool called PuTTY in order to SSH. So I want to SSH into the master, and I want to create a tunnel. Make sense? So let's do that. So I'm going to go to the master, and go to the master's public IP address, and I'm just going to copy that public IP address. Okay, it's copied. Now I'm going to open up a tool called PuTTY. This is just a Windows tool that allows you to SSH in easily. So I'm going to that IP address, to port 22, and I'm going to click on the SSH tab, and I'm going to go to auth. And here's where I need to get my private key. So I'm just going to pass it my private key, and I'm going to open up a tunnel here. So the tunnel is to 8080, which is what DCOS's UI runs on. Did I spell localhost right there? Yeah? Okay. Still can't see. I'm going to log in. So now I have a tunnel open to the master node in my DCOS cluster. Okay? The head master node. The head master. See that? Take you back to school? Get in trouble. The principal node. So we're going to the master node. So let's go ahead and go to localhost 8080. I think we probably have Tomcat still up and running, so let's stop Tomcat because it's on the same. It was on the same Port. Okay.
Restart PuTTY.
What's that?
We need to restart PuTTY.
Restart PuTTY? I don't think so. Oh, well, let's try it. Let's see. I can't see the restart session.
Let's go to duplicate session.
Yeah, let's just close it. We'll just. There should be a restart session, shouldn't there? Good Lord. Hang on, so let me close out Eclipse and make sure that's not getting in my way. So it stops, not on 8080. Just make sure nothing's running on 8080. So it's trying to get to DCS, won't get there. So let's open up the PuTTY session.
Do you need to restart the service on the container itself?
No. Okay. Yeah. All right. So up and running. One demo that fails, that's somewhat acceptable. If two of them fails, you're pretty much a punk. Okay. So I've got ACS up and running. I've got ACS up and running, DCLS. I've got nothing running in here. So let's go over to Marathon. So I'm going to open up localhost 8080 to Marathon, which is the scheduler for DCLS, or the default scheduler on it is for DCLS. So let's go to Marathon. And we can see I don't have any applications created. Okay? So the first thing I did, if you remember, I wanted to deploy a load balancer into my public agent pool. Okay? So I'm going to do that. Let's go to DCOS, and we can go to the universe. These are, and the universe in DCOS world, these are a bunch of packages or containers that I'm able to install just by clicking on a button, analogous to Docker Hub. So let's go down to Marathon LB. Click on it, click Install Package. I'm going to take the defaults, and Marathon's now installed. So if we take a look, give this guy a second, you can see Marathon LB is now deploying into DCLS. Now, do you remember that little crappy MVC app I wrote, the Hello ContainerDays, whatever thing I did? I can't remember if I pushed that up into Docker Hub or not. Let's deploy that from Docker Hub. So I actually have the definition of that file here. So we can go ahead, we'll take a look at this JSON in a second. But this is the deployment file that DCOS needs. I'm going to click Create Application. I'm going to choose JSON mode. And if we take a look at this thing, you can see I'm deploying basically a Docker container. The images are Bagby WAC Spring MVC app. That's sitting in Docker Hub, so it knows how to get to it. And you can see I've told it what my vhost is down here. And so that is the URI to my agent. So if you remember, I showed you the public IP address that had the DNS entry. That's the DNS entry to the load balancer that's sitting in front of my public agents. Okay? So this is going to get balanced by that Marathon LB application I have. So let's deploy this thing. Click Create, and let's see it deploy. Should be almost instantaneous. So if it should be instantaneous, it'll probably take about 5 minutes today. There we go. I've got 2 instances up and running. So now, if I go out to that URI, so let's just take again a look at this file. If I go out to this URI, in a browser, and I think it was called, what was it called? Products Web, greeting.html. We'll see that I'm hitting my load balanced. If I opened up other browsers and kept hitting this thing, it's going to round robin across those two. I think I deployed it to 2 nodes in my ACS cluster. Okay. I think I got about 5 minutes left, so let me just do a couple more things here. If we take a look, if we go back into Marathon, if I wanted to scale this thing out, all I had to do is click Scale. Now I can choose 3, scale the app, and it's now almost instantaneously going to be running out on 3 nodes. Okay. So hopefully what you've seen, we didn't do anything. None of this work was us. Just one second, I'll take the question to the end. We didn't do anything. This is all Marathon and Mesos all running. What we did was deploy it for you in a proper fashion, of giving you access to, giving you support, as well as allowing you to deploy this very simply instead of having to do all the work. You can concentrate on your application. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at 2 more things real quick, and then I'll do one more demo, and then we'll have a look at the Windows container, see if it works. .NET running on Linux. If you're not familiar with .NET Core is a subset of .NET. And it's cross-platform. You can run on Windows, you can run on Linux, you can run on Mac OS. It's open source. It's modular. So everything is, our package manager in .NET is called NuGet. So all of the packages are in NuGet packages, and so you can deploy something with a very small footprint in .NET Core. And deploy it out to a variety of platforms. In fact, we can take a quick look at that. I have, using Visual Studio Code, I have, again, built out an MVC app in .NET Core. Okay? And so this MVC app, you can see it's got a bunch of controllers. It's got its views. I'm not going to run it up here because that'll take some time. But I wrote a Docker file for this thing. Okay? And so for the Docker file for this, see if I can find that. Let's see. Give me a second. I'll show you the Docker file, and then we'll deploy this thing into Mesos. Training, and then that was .NET Core, and MVC sample, and source. And you can see the Docker files right here. So if I open that with Notepad, you can see this is running from, it's called Microsoft WAC.NET latest. Okay, so that's my base image. And you can see I'm just going to walk down through all of this. And I'm basically, this is a Docker file that I'll run inside of a Linux box. So it runs .NET. You can see the restore does a build. So the restore is where it's going to bring down all the NuGet packages, all of its dependencies. It's going to build it. And then we're exposing this thing through port 5000. And then you can see that the command we're running is .NET run on port 5000. So I've already built this thing. I've pushed it out into Docker Hub. And so what I can do is I can take another definition, which is pointing at .NET Core. We go back into Mesos. In Marathon, I'm going to kill Spring MVC app. In Marathon, you destroy, you don't kill. And you can see here, this is my .NET Core image, and this is what I pushed out to DCOS, and that's that little .NET application that I'm going to deploy into the exact same containers, Linux machines, that we have running in Mesos. And you'll see it'll just take a couple seconds here. Marathon. 5 minutes. Yep, sounds good. That was a quick 5 minutes. Okay, and it's up and running. So now we can go to that same URI. And I'm running my .NET Core application. This is a little .NET Core app, MVC app that I wrote running in Linux container. Cool? 5 minutes. I'm gonna try one more last time to tell that into that box. And then I'm gonna give up. No, it may not be running. Maybe the box. I don't know. We'll see what. I'll figure that out later. Last thing is enterprise solutions. This will take 2 seconds, and then we can walk through any questions you have. So enterprise solutions, we work closely with Docker and with Mesosphere. You can go out to the Azure Marketplace, and you can deploy either of those on the Azure Marketplace. If your company is interested in running either of those, and you want to get some, you want to speak with somebody from either Docker or Mesosphere, you can ping me. I'll put my email address up here in a second, and I'll put you in touch with the right people that will help you to answer any questions that you might have. Or I'll try and answer whatever questions you have. So, questions?
Any performance metrics or telemetry being collected as part of this PCOS deployment? Fast deployment?
The question is there any telemetry as to?
Performance metrics being collected out of the box as part of the managed offering?
I don't know if we've published any telemetry or any metrics on that. I do know that we work closely with Mesosphere and and Docker in order to optimize the environment. So the architecture has been blessed by those parties, but I don't know that we've published any.
I was thinking if I deploy that, I just want to see how they're doing. Is anything observable?
Oh, you want to know, can you get access to the telemetry on this yourself? Oh yeah, all of that data is available to you. In fact, if you go out and talk to some of the partners out here, Sysdig is actually pretty good at integrating.
Is there anything out of the box?
Yeah, you can get that all through the portal as well. Yeah, in fact, if you go through the deployment, you can actually tell it to turn on diagnostics, and then that data is available to you. There's a variety of, I didn't show you all the storage containers, but there's a bunch of storage containers that get deployed, and the telemetry gets pushed into the storage containers, and you have access to that data. You can ping me offline, and I can give you the particulars. Question?
What are the licensing requirements for using a Windows container?
So the licensing requirements for Windows Container, depending upon what version of Windows Server you have, there's 2 versions. I think there's Standard and then there's Data Center. Standard, you can run as many Windows containers as you want. The licensing is baked into it, but you can build 2 Hyper-V containers. It's very similar to what you have for VMs. It's similar to the licensing for VMs. Data Center is different, still all the Windows containers you want, but I can't remember the number of Hyper-V containers. It may be unlimited, I can't remember. But if you send me email, I can point you to a link that'll tell you what it is. It's a lot, but that's for the data center. Any other questions?
So are you looking at Kubernetes for Azure as well?
You can already run Kubernetes on Azure. As far as running it in ACS, that's kind of up to the ACS team. Our ACS team is run by a guy named Ross Gardler. He's the president of the Apache Software Foundation.
I know Ross.
You know Ross, good. So those are decisions that Ross and his team make, and when they make them, I work pretty closely with Ross. When they make those decisions, they let us know, and then we talk about it. I don't know what they're doing behind the scenes on that.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
So are the containers portable across Windows and Linux? I mean, I don't know whether I got that.
So the question is, can I run a Windows container on Linux? No. So the underlying kernel, you can run Linux containers on Linux, and you can run Windows containers on Windows, but you can run different versions of Windows on Windows containers, just like you can run Debian or Ubuntu or whatever on Linux. So they don't cross. They're totally separate.
Yeah, because I thought you said something about C groups and namespaces that they were support
I said
something.
Linux has C groups and namespaces. We built abstractions that are similar to those that allow us to support containers on Windows, but they're not cross-compatible.
Can you run SQL Server in a container?
Can you run SQL Server in a container? Yes, you can run SQL Server in a container. I've seen people that have worked on that. I don't think that they're to the point where it's production quality yet. I think it has to do with the storage volumes, and I'm not quite sure where that is. If you're interested in that, send me an email, and I'll get back to you.
Can you run Visual Studio in a
Sure.
container?
The question is, can you run Visual Studio in a container? Yes.
And presumably run that through, so you can run that in a container, you can push that onto like some of the Jenkins, and then redistribute back out to another container. So like a
So
pipeline that's-
what I did, what you would have seen had I been able to RDP into that box would have been essentially a Visual Studio that I wasn't running in a container, but I did have Visual Studio running locally that I was pushing into GitHub. Jenkins was pulling it out of, Jenkins pulls it out of GitHub, builds a container, and then runs the tests inside of that container. So not only feasible, I've done it, and if you want to hook up later, I can show you that.
Sorry, just one other question.
It's going to be the last question because I think I'm out of time.
One other question just about the registry. So Docker registry, at the moment, the online version still has Microsoft images, right? So if I wanted to pull an image
Yes.
from Docker registry. So the other point would be is...
You're talking about Docker Hub, right?
Yeah, Docker Hub.
Yeah, Docker Hub has both Windows as well as Linux images.
So in Windows 2016, you have the ability to take the Docker, it's equivalent to Docker Trusted Registry behind the firewall and mount your own Docker registry.
So run your own private registry is what you're
Yeah, so
asking.
pretty much with investment bank, right, we have firewalls
Yep.
outside, so we want to take that
Yeah, you
offline.
have two options there. You can run in Azure, you can run your own private registry using Azure Storage as its back end. That's easy enough to do. But you can also use Docker Datacenter, which has which behind your firewall, which has Docker Trusted Registry, which you can use. So you can run your own open source registry or use Docker Datacenter. All right, well, thank you very much. Sorry the second didn't work, but.